The year is 1888. The heart of Arkansas lies in the quiet rustle of farmland fields, the heavy creak of wooden wagons, and the hushed murmurs of communities bound by tradition and faith. The air is thick with the smell of soil after rain, the songs of whippoorwills echoing through the trees, and the ever-present weight of small-town life where everyone knows everyone, and secrets are almost impossible to keep. Yet in this stillness, in this world where family values were sacred and the bond of blood was unbreakable, a scandal would emerge so shocking, so unthinkable, that even more than a century later, it echoes as one of the darkest tales in American history. Picture a dirt road winding through a sleepy Arkansas village, lit only by flickering lanterns. A church bell tolls in the distance, signaling evening prayer, while neighbors gather on porches, rocking slowly in wooden chairs. Life here is slow, predictable, governed by routines passed down through generations. But beneath the calm exterior lies an unease, a storm brewing in whispers. By candlelight, families share rumors of a story so scandalous that it feels almost unreal. They lean in close, voices hushed, glances darting around to ensure no one overhears. What could shatter the moral fabric of such a devout community? What could bring shame heavy enough to be spoken of in whispers for decades to come? The answer comes like a blade tearing through the heart of tradition. A father stole his son's bride. Not just a rumor, not just idle talk, but a truth that rattled the very foundations of kinship and honor in this tight-knit community. A son, filled with the excitement of starting a new life, preparing to marry the woman he loved. A father, meant to guide and bless that union, instead stepping into the role of groom himself. Imagine the betrayal, the devastation, the sheer disbelief. A father marries his own son's bride. What drove a man to cross that line? Was it lust masquerading as love? Was it a hunger for youth and beauty he no longer possessed? Or was it the ultimate act of betrayal, fueled by jealousy of his son's happiness? These are the questions that haunt this tale, questions that claw at the mind and refuse to let go. The setting itself magnifies the scandal. In a place where the church stood at the center of every town, where sermons thundered against sin and immorality, this act was not merely personal betrayal, but spiritual treason. Marriages were sacred, family bonds inviolable. To break both in one act was to invite condemnation not just from neighbors, but from God himself. This was not the kind of story that could fade quietly into the night. It was the kind of story that would spread like wildfire, igniting anger, shame, and a thirst for understanding how such a thing could happen. Close your eyes and imagine that wedding day. The bride, young and beautiful, adorned in white lace, her heart torn between duty and confusion. The son, betrayed, his dreams collapsing into dust. And the father, standing tall yet shadowed by desire, his choice condemning him in the eyes of all. What words were spoken in that small church? What glances exchanged across the pews as the vows were recited? Could the community believe what they were seeing, or did they cling to denial, hoping they had misheard? The echoes of the scandal did not stop with that marriage ceremony. They spilled into every conversation, every pew, every farm field, where men worked silently beside one another, each too afraid to speak of what had happened, but unable to stop thinking of it. The whispers of women carrying laundry to rivers, the furtive discussions between children who only half understood, the gravity of the story, all wove together to create an atmosphere of suffocating curiosity and dread. But perhaps the most chilling part of all is that history has nearly buried this tale. Only fragments remain, hidden in old newspaper clippings, passed down in folklore, recalled by those who dare to remember. And yet those fragments are enough to raise questions that still demand answers today. Why did the bride consent? Was she coerced? Trapped in a world where women had little say in their fate? Did she feel forced to honor a family arrangement gone horribly wrong? Or did she harbor her own secrets, her own reasons for turning from the son to the father? This is not merely a story of a marriage gone wrong. It is a story that rips open the most primal fears of betrayal, when the very people meant to protect us, our own blood, become the source of our deepest wounds. It is a tale that transcends time, for even now in the modern world, The betrayal of family, the crossing of boundaries, the corruption of love into obsession remains one of the most devastating acts imaginable. Tonight, as you listen, we will walk the dirt roads of 1888 Arkansas together. We will sit in the candlelit rooms where gossip turned into shock, where scandal turned into history. We will peer into the hearts of a father, a son, and a bride caught in the middle of a storm no one could have imagined. Was it madness? Was it a forbidden passion too strong to resist? Or was it at its core an act of selfishness so vile it would forever scar an entire family? The answers lie not just in the facts, but in the shadows between them. And as the story unfolds, you must decide for yourself. Was this tragedy born of love, or was it born of betrayal? For in the silence of 1888 Arkansas, one thing is certain: the echoes of that forbidden marriage still haunt the land, and the questions it raised still linger like ghosts in the night. Arkansas in 1888 was a world suspended between tradition and the slow march of modernity. The state was still recovering from the shadows of the Civil War, its people deeply rooted in the land, living by the rhythms of harvest and the dictates of the seasons. Wooden cabins dotted the rolling hills, and farms stretched out across fields of cotton and corn. The roads were mostly dirt, rutted by wagon wheels, and the sound of horses' hooves was far more common than the hum of industry. It was a life defined by simplicity and hardship, but also by an unyielding code of values. Family was the core of existence, honor the measure of a person's worth, and the church the beating heart of every town. In small-town Arkansas, everyone knew everyone. A family's name was its most valuable possession, built over generations and carefully protected. Gossip was not just idle chatter. It was a currency that shaped reputations and determined who could be trusted. Every action, every word carried weight, because in a community so tightly bound, nothing remained hidden for long. A single rumor could stain a family forever, and to lose the respect of one's neighbors was to be cast into a kind of living exile. The church tower rose above every settlement, its bell marking the passage of time as much as it summoned the faithful. Sunday was more than a day of worship. It was the anchor of the week, a gathering where the town's unity was displayed and its morals reinforced. Preachers thundered from pulpits about sin, redemption, and the dangers of temptation. Marriage in particular was exalted as a sacred covenant, ordained by God and sanctified by the community. To marry was not merely to bind two individuals. It was to tie families together, to secure the future, and to uphold divine order. Breaking that order was unthinkable, not only an insult to society, but an affront to heaven itself. Marriage during this era often bore little resemblance to the romantic ideals of later generations. Courtships were brief, formal, and closely observed by families. In many cases, unions were practical arrangements, forged to secure land, labor, or stability. Love, if it blossomed, was considered a blessing, but it was not always the foundation. Still, the institution itself was sacrosanct. A bride's virtue was her greatest treasure, guarded fiercely by her parents and watched over by the community. A groom's honor was measured not only by his ability to provide, but also by his loyalty and integrity. To betray a marriage was to unravel the social fabric, and to betray one's own family in that covenant was a sin beyond comprehension. Life in rural Arkansas demanded adherence to tradition, for survival itself often depended on cooperation. Neighbors shared tools, lent animals, and worked fields together during harvest. A man who lost the respect of his peers could find himself without aid in times of need, a terrifying prospect in a world where a bad crop or a sudden illness could ruin a family. Honor and reputation were not abstract concepts. They were lifelines. It was within this fragile balance of faith, duty, and community that the story of the forbidden marriage emerged. And it was this very balance that magnified its horror. To fully grasp the magnitude of the scandal, one must understand how deeply intertwined family and faith were. Fathers were seen as the guardians of morality, the leaders of the household, tasked with guiding their sons into manhood and ensuring the preservation of values. Sons were expected to honor their fathers, to carry forward their legacy, and to build upon the foundation laid for them. A bride entering into a family was not merely a wife to her husband, but a daughter to her in-laws, embraced into the fold and bound by loyalty. For a father to betray his son by coveting and ultimately claiming his bride was not simply a breach of etiquette, it was a catastrophic inversion of the natural order. In such a world, gossip thrived because it was fueled by moral accountability. Women gathering at wells or rivers to wash clothes would exchange stories, each detail embroidered with emotion. Men, silent in their fields, would hear whispers carried across furrows, their trust in one another shaken by the knowledge of betrayal within their midst. Children, half aware, caught fragments of conversations and repeated them in play, unknowingly carrying the scandal further. Every corner of the community became saturated with the weight of what had happened. The shock was not merely that a man had stolen his son's bride, but that he had desecrated the very ideals upon which the community's survival depended. If fathers could not be trusted to uphold morality, if marriages could be corrupted by the very figures meant to sanctify them, then what safety was left? This was not simply a private sin, it was a wound inflicted on the entire town. A reminder that even in the most devout and orderly societies, darkness could seep in through the cracks. As the story began to spread, it was filtered through the lens of outrage and disbelief. Some refused to believe it entirely, insisting that no man could stoop so low. Others seized upon it as proof of hidden corruption, a sign that even the most respectable families could conceal shameful secrets. The scandal forced the town to confront uncomfortable truths about human desire, power, and weakness. It showed them that no code, no matter how strict, could fully contain the impulses of the human heart. In 1888 Arkansas, to marry one's son's bride was not just an act of betrayal, it was an abomination against the unwritten laws of kinship, faith, and honor. It was a story that defied comprehension, leaving neighbors staring at one another in disbelief, whispering behind closed doors, and wondering what could drive a man to cross a line so sacred. It was a story that could not be explained away, and because it could not be explained, it festered in the collective memory, a scar on the town's moral landscape. This was the world in which the forbidden marriage unfolded, a world where family was sacred, marriage inviolable, and honor the lifeblood of survival. And it was precisely this world that made the scandal not just shocking, but devastating beyond measure. A tale that would outlive its participants and echo through history as a warning of how fragile the bonds of trust can truly be. The story of the forbidden marriage cannot be understood without first stepping into the lives of the three figures at its center: the father, the son, and the bride. Each of them carried with them their own histories, their own desires, and their own place in the small Arkansas community of 1888. To the outside world, they may have seemed ordinary, but beneath the surface lay currents of longing, pride, and resentment that would eventually converge into scandal. The father was a man in his late 40s, weathered by years of toil on the land. His hands bore the calluses of endless labor. His skin bronzed by sun, his back slightly stooped from carrying burdens both physical and unseen. Yet he was not without authority. In the eyes of the town, he was a man of stature, a farmer who had built his family's livelihood with hard work and who commanded a degree of respect. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to being listened to, a patriarch whose word weighed heavily in his household. To his neighbors, he was stern but reliable, the kind of man whose nod in church signified approval and whose silence signaled disfavor. Yet behind the stern exterior was a restless spirit, one that had grown weary of age pressing down upon him, of watching his youth fade while others still basked in the fire of beginnings. The son, by contrast, was in his early 20s, standing at the threshold of manhood with all the eagerness and hope that youth affords. He was strong, full of energy, and carried a kind of charm that made him well-liked in the community. Unlike his father, his face was unlined, his future unwritten. Where the father was rigid, the son was open, smiling easily, quick to laugh, and unburdened by the weight of decades of hardship. He embodied the promise of a new generation, a man ready to start his own family, to carry forward the legacy his father had laid before him. Yet he also bore within him a quiet determination, a belief that his path should be his own, even if it sometimes put him at odds with his father's stern expectations. And then there was the bride, the figure who would forever stand between father and son. She was young, likely still in her late teens, her presence a blend of innocence and allure. To the townspeople, she was a picture of beauty. Her hair long and dark, her cheeks flushed with vitality, her eyes bright with the spark of youth. She came from a respectable family, modest in means but rich in reputation, and her virtues were spoken of with approval at church gatherings. She was known to be kind, dutiful and graceful in her manners. Yet like many young women of her time, her life's course was not her own to set. Marriage was both expectation and destiny, and when the son courted her, it was with the knowledge that her future lay in the bond she would create with him. The courtship between the son and his bride-to-be was the kind that warmed the hearts of their neighbors. Their union seemed destined, the natural progression of two families bound by friendship and mutual respect. The son would visit her home, offering small tokens of affection, his earnestness winning the approval of her parents. They walked together after church, sometimes under the watchful eyes of townsfolk who nodded in satisfaction at the sight of young love blossoming. Their engagement was celebrated in whispers of joy, women discussing the wedding preparations, men remarking on how the son was becoming a man ready to shoulder responsibility. For a time, theirs was a story of hope, a reminder to the community that traditions endured and the cycle of life continued as it always had. Yet beneath this surface of joy lay faint shadows of tension. The father, though proud of his son's coming marriage, carried within him a quiet discontent. Perhaps it was the way his son's bride laughed, her voice light and musical, that stirred something he had long thought buried. Perhaps it was the sight of her youth beside his son's, a reminder of what he had lost to time. His glances lingered too long, his presence sometimes too close, though most brushed it off as the natural watchfulness of a father, ensuring his son's path was true. But within the household, the son noticed. He noticed the way his father's tone shifted when the bride was near. The way his words sometimes carried an edge that felt less like guidance and more like rivalry. Their relationship, once defined by clear lines of authority, began to strain under these unspoken tensions. The son sought independence, eager to prove himself capable of leading a family of his own, while the father seemed unwilling to loosen his grip, as if afraid of being left behind. Small disagreements over farm work or family matters became sharper, more personal. The bride, caught in the middle, was polite and respectful, yet her very presence seemed to widen the gulf between father and son. The community, absorbed in preparations for the upcoming marriage, saw little of this strain. To them, the family represented stability, continuity, and respectability. They celebrated the engagement with genuine delight, never suspecting that beneath the smiles and handshakes lay a storm waiting to break. Yet, in quiet moments, when the father's gaze lingered too long, or when the son's jaw tightened with unspoken resentment, the threads of the family bond were beginning to fray. This was the backdrop against which the scandal would unfold. A father respected but restless, a son full of hope yet burdened by his father's shadow, and a bride who embodied the promise of youth but would become the symbol of betrayal. Together their lives formed the perfect storm of desire, rivalry, and destiny, a storm that would not only destroy the harmony of a single household, but would shock an entire community into disbelief. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, the way most forbidden desires do. The father never intended to feel what he felt. At first, he watched his son and bride-to-be with the detached pride of a man who had done his duty, who had raised his son into manhood and was now prepared to hand him the reins of a new life. But admiration has a way of shifting into something else, something darker, when it lingers too long. His glances, which once carried the weight of approval, began to carry the trace of something unspoken, something he did not allow himself to name. He told himself it was nothing. A father could admire the grace of a young woman, her laughter, her spirit, her beauty. There was nothing wrong in that. Yet each day the admiration grew sharper, more insistent, until it gnawed at him like hunger. The bride was innocent of this at first. She carried herself with respect toward him, always soft-spoken, addressing him with the courtesy expected of a young woman toward her future father-in-law. She thanked him for his hospitality when she visited the family home, offered to help with small chores, and listened with polite interest when he spoke of crops, livestock, or the hardships of the past. But those simple gestures, meant only as kindness, stirred something inside him that had long lain dormant. The way she smoothed her hair behind her ear when she laughed, the way her voice carried when she sang in church, even the way her eyes met his in brief, fleeting moments, all became sparks in the dry field of his discontent. At first he fought it. He reminded himself of his place, of his duty as a father, of the commandments preached every Sunday from the pulpit. He was to guide his son, to bless his marriage, to take pride in watching a new household flourish. The thought of betraying that trust filled him with shame. In the quiet of the night, as he lay awake listening to the creaks of the old farmhouse, he would pray silently, begging God to take away the thoughts that plagued him. Yet the more he fought them, the stronger they seemed to grow, until shame itself began to twist into desire. The moments between them began to stretch longer than they should. When the bride came to the house, he found reasons to linger in the same room. He offered to show her how to tend the garden or feed the animals, simple tasks that allowed him to stand close, to speak with her in the hushed tones of instruction. If their hands brushed, however briefly, he felt it burn through him like fire. She, perhaps naive or perhaps wary, seemed not to notice, or perhaps she chose not to acknowledge it, unwilling to disrupt the fragile balance of respect between them. But others began to sense something was not quite right. Neighbors observed that the father was unusually present during the couple's courtship, hovering in ways that seemed unnecessary. At church gatherings, his eyes followed her too often, his posture stiff whenever she stood near his son. Women, especially, were quick to pick up on these subtle cues. Whispers began, soft at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. "He seems too watchful," one might murmur. "Too eager to be involved." Men, slower to notice, brushed it aside as a father's natural protectiveness. But in a town where reputations lived and died on perception, even the smallest doubt could take root. Inside his mind, the struggle only deepened. He knew the gravity of his feelings, knew the destruction they would bring if ever acted upon. He told himself he could stop, that he would stop, that this was nothing more than a passing weakness. But with each day, he felt less like a father and more like a rival. When he saw his son and bride walking together, their laughter spilling into the air, he felt something corrosive rise in his chest, not pride, but envy. He began to resent his own son for possessing what he desired, a resentment that twisted love into bitterness. The bride, caught in this unspoken storm, may have felt the weight of his gaze. Perhaps she noticed the way he lingered too close, the way his words carried an undercurrent she could not name. Did she feel flattered by the attention of an older man, or did it unsettle her, a shadow she could not shake? History gives us no clear answers, but it is hard to imagine she was entirely oblivious. In a society so strict, where propriety governed every gesture, even the faintest breach of boundaries would have been felt like a tremor. Still, nothing overt was said. No accusations were made. Life continued as it always had. Weddings planned, fields tended, sermons preached. Yet beneath the ordinary routines lay a current of tension, subtle but undeniable. A glance too long, a word too soft, a silence too heavy. The father's obsession was no longer confined to his private thoughts. It seeped into his every action, staining the fabric of daily life. For him, the conflict became unbearable. He was torn between two selves, the father bound by duty and the man consumed by desire. Each day he swore to himself he would master it, that he would bury his longing and walk the path expected of him. But each day he failed, and each failure pulled him deeper into obsession. He began to see the marriage not as a bond he was meant to bless, but as a threat to his own secret yearning. The thought of his son claiming what he could not bear to relinquish filled him with a jealousy so fierce it overshadowed reason. The whispers in the community grew louder, though still cloaked in careful language. A neighbor's raised eyebrow, a quiet question about why the father was always present, a knowing look exchanged between women at the market. No one dared confront it directly, but the unease was spreading. Something unnatural was unfolding, something that defied the roles everyone had been taught to revere. A father should stand beside his son, not in his place. A father should guide, not covet. And yet, as the wedding day drew closer, it seemed more and more that the boundaries between father and son, between protector and rival, were dangerously close to collapsing. What began as a forbidden thought had grown into an obsession, one that no prayer, no sermon, no sense of duty could extinguish. The father's inner struggle had turned into a war he was losing, and the world around him, his son, his bride, his community, was about to feel the devastating impact of his surrender. Beneath the Arkansas sky of 1888, where cicadas sang their endless hymn and lanterns flickered in farmhouse windows, the small town was abuzz with anticipation. A wedding was always more than a union between two souls. It was a communal celebration, a marker of stability, and a reminder of values cherished. The bride-to-be had become the centerpiece of whispers in church aisles and general stores. Every woman commented on her beauty, her poise, her future role as a wife, and every man admired the young couple's promising path. The son, full of quiet pride, carried himself with the eagerness of a man on the threshold of a new life, his dreams finally taking shape in the form of the woman he adored. The father, meanwhile, carried an expression no one quite deciphered, an unreadable mask that concealed the storm brewing beneath. Preparations unfolded in a flurry. Women stitched lace, ironed linens, and discussed floral arrangements. Men handled the logistics of food, music, and transportation. In a town bound tightly by tradition, every step of the wedding was guided by precedent. The church bells had already been polished to gleam, ready to toll for the joyous occasion. Invitations, though few were formally written, had spread by word of mouth. The event promised to be one of the most celebrated gatherings the town had seen in years. And yet, beneath the harmonious rhythm of preparations, shadows stretched longer than the daylight. Something intangible pressed upon the edges of normalcy, a creeping unease that no one dared name. The father's presence during preparations was noticeable, though not yet suspicious. He lingered where the bride was, offering assistance that others might have brushed off as helpfulness. When the young women gathered to arrange bouquets, he appeared to ask if any heavy lifting was needed. When fabric for the bridal dress was unrolled, his fingers grazed the lace as though imagining something far beyond cloth. His words, polite on the surface, carried an undertone that made the bride shift uneasily when no one else was watching. To the community, he was simply the head of the household, ensuring his son's happiness. To the bride, he was becoming a shadow she could neither fully understand nor escape. On the eve of the marriage, the town seemed to hold its breath. The son, unable to contain his excitement, stayed up late with friends, laughing about the life ahead, painting visions of the farm he would build, the children he would raise, and the devotion he felt for the woman who had chosen him. The bride, in her chamber, carefully folded her gown, her heart racing with nervous anticipation. The father, alone in the dim silence of his room, wrestled with a torment that had reached its breaking point. What began as glances and thoughts had grown into a consuming fire, one that morality could no longer suppress. Duty, family, religion. These voices were drowned out by something darker and more desperate. The betrayal unfolded like a tragedy scripted long before its time. Whether in secrecy under the cloak of night or in brazen defiance of dawn's first light, the father acted with shocking finality. Some say he approached the bride with words drenched in persuasion, cloaking his obsession as a declaration of love. Others believed coercion was at play, that he leveraged authority and power to bend her fate. What remains consistent in every retelling is the shattering revelation that the bride was no longer destined to marry the son, but bound instead to the father. The scandal erupted not with ceremony, but with whispers that spread faster than wildfire through the fields and along the dusty roads. The son's devastation cannot be overstated. A man raised in a society that treasured honor above all else, he now stood humiliated, betrayed, and stripped of both his bride and his dignity. His anguish was not only personal but public, for every gaze in town turned upon him with pity, disbelief, or cruel fascination. His father had not simply stolen the woman he loved, he had torn apart the sacred fabric of trust that bound a family together. Nights once filled with dreams of the future were replaced by sleepless hours of torment, haunted by the image of the woman he adored, standing beside the very man who should have protected their union. For the community, the scandal was an earthquake. The church, once the center of guidance, fumbled to make sense of such a breach of morality. Families whispered at dinner tables, neighbors exchanged sideways glances, and no one could enter the town square without hearing some variation of the story. Was it madness that drove the father? Was the bride complicit or trapped? Had the son seen signs he had ignored? These questions clawed at the conscience of every listener, for the tale was not just about betrayal. It was about the fragility of the moral codes that held their lives together. The betrayal hung over the town like a storm that would not break. The son carried himself like a man hollowed from within, his youthful brightness dimmed, his trust in life shattered. The father, though now bound to the bride, could not walk the streets without sensing the weight of condemnation pressing upon him. The bride herself became a figure both pitied and judged, her name tied forever to a scandal that would echo through generations. The wedding that should have been a moment of celebration became instead a tale of ruin, a forbidden union etched into the haunted memory of Arkansas in 1888. The news spread like fire in dry grass, leaping from one farmhouse to the next, carried by whispers that traveled faster than any horse or telegram could. It began quietly, almost hesitantly, as if the scandal were too unspeakable to put into words. A woman at the well murmured it to her neighbor, a shopkeeper confided it to a regular customer, and within hours the entire town was buzzing with disbelief. In a place as small and tightly woven as rural Arkansas in 1888, where every family knew the lineage of another and reputations were often valued more than land itself, the notion that a father had taken his son's bride was more than a scandal. It was a cataclysm. The first waves of reaction came from the family itself, a household now split by something irreparable. The son, humiliated and heartbroken, could hardly look anyone in the eye. His sisters, if he had them, carried their shame silently, shielding their faces in church pews while the congregation stared. The mother, if still alive, bore the heaviest burden of all, for she was forced to reconcile her role as wife with the monstrous act her husband had committed. Even relatives who lived miles away felt the sting of dishonor, their own names dragged into the mire simply by association. In a society where family honor dictated social standing, the betrayal destroyed more than one man's future. It cast a shadow over the entire bloodline. The church's response was swift and uncompromising. Sunday sermons became fiery lectures, the preacher's voice rising with indignation as he condemned lust, betrayal, and the breaking of sacred vows. The pulpit trembled beneath the weight of his words, and the congregation sat in tense silence, knowing every reference pointed directly toward the family at the center of the storm. The church bells, once expected to ring in celebration of a union, instead tolled as if mourning the death of decency itself. Parishioners debated furiously in hushed tones after service. Was the bride a victim, lured into a trap by an older man's influence, or had she secretly harbored feelings that betrayed her fiancé? Was the father consumed by madness, or simply wicked at his core? None could agree, but all found their faith tested as they struggled to reconcile their beliefs with the grotesque reality unfolding before them. Neighbors added fuel to the fire with their gossip. In general stores, farmers leaned across counters, lowering their voices to trade theories about how long the affair had been brewing. Women in sewing circles recounted every glance, every moment they now recalled as suspicious. Times the father lingered too long in the bride's presence, or when she seemed nervous in his company. Children whispered on the way to school, repeating stories they scarcely understood. while adults shook their heads in dismay at the loss of innocence their community had suffered. The scandal became a currency of conversation, traded with relish, even by those who claimed to be disgusted. Every corner of the town echoed with the same refrain: how could such a thing happen here, among people they thought they knew? The newspapers seized the story, spreading it beyond the boundaries of the town and making the family's humiliation complete. Headlines screamed of betrayal and sin, written with sensationalist flair, designed to sell copies, but also to stoke outrage. The father was painted as a villain, a man who had betrayed not only his son, but the sanctity of family itself. The bride was depicted with cruel ambiguity, sometimes pitied as a victim, other times vilified as a temptress. The son, meanwhile, was portrayed as the tragic figure, robbed of both love and dignity, his suffering laid bare for the public's consumption. Readers from nearby towns devoured the scandal, grateful, perhaps, that such darkness had not taken root in their own communities, while secretly drawn to the story's forbidden allure. As the scandal deepened, moral debates fractured the community. Some held to the belief that the father had committed the ultimate sin, one that demanded not only excommunication from the church, but perhaps even divine retribution. Others, though fewer in number, suggested that love, in its strangest forms, could not be confined by rules of kinship and society. These contrarian voices were quickly silenced by the majority, who viewed such reasoning as dangerous justification for an act that threatened the very fabric of their moral order. The debate was not merely about one family's choices, it was about the soul of the community itself, a test of whether tradition, honor, and faith could withstand the shock of such betrayal. Rumors grew wilder with every retelling. Some claimed the bride had fallen under a spell of manipulation, her will bent by the father's cunning. Others insisted she must have wanted the arrangement, that her love for the son had never been real. There were whispers that the son had suspected something but chosen silence out of fear or denial. And still darker tales suggested the family had been cursed, that this was merely the latest tragedy in a line of misfortunes. With each retelling, facts blurred into fiction until truth became a rare commodity, nearly impossible to separate from the swirling storm of gossip. What remained constant in every version of the story was the sense of outrage, the communal wound inflicted by the scandal. The town prided itself on its values: honor, loyalty, devotion to God and family, and the betrayal mocked them all. It left people questioning their neighbors, re-evaluating their trust, and even fearing that such corruption could lurk beneath the surface of any household. The betrayal was not confined to one family. It bled into the consciousness of the entire community, reshaping the way they saw themselves. And as the weeks stretched on, the outrage did not fade but hardened, crystallizing into a story that would haunt Arkansas for generations. In 1888 Arkansas, the law was often viewed as both a shield of order and a mirror of community morality. But when it came to matters as scandalous as a father taking his son's bride, the lines blurred between legality, sin, and public outrage. Marriage in that era was governed not only by statutes but also by deeply ingrained customs tied to religion and family honor. The state recognized marriage as a sacred contract, one meant to preserve lineage, property rights, and societal stability. While incest in the narrow sense of the term was outlawed, the Father's Act fell into a disturbing gray area, hovering between legal technicalities and moral abomination. He had not married a blood relative, but the scandal reeked of incestuous betrayal, a kind of violation that the written law struggled to address in clear terms. Bigamy was another matter. If the father still had a living wife, his union with his son's bride could be challenged as unlawful, potentially null and void in the eyes of both the law and the church. Even if he was widowed, the union raised questions of propriety that no courthouse in the state wanted to touch. Judges, bound by the letter of the law, could issue rulings on property, inheritance, or legitimacy of children born from such a marriage. But they could not legislate away the shame that clung to the scandal. And in a time when reputations carried as much weight as legal documents, the father's actions branded him guilty in the court of public opinion long before any formal proceedings could occur. Religious condemnation came swiftly, more decisive than any gavel could strike. Preachers thundered from pulpits, declaring the act not merely unlawful, but a sin that stained the soul. Congregations were reminded of biblical commandments, of the sacred trust between father and son, and of the divine wrath that awaited those who broke such bonds. The father was cast as a figure of corruption, likened to the sinners of Scripture who met tragic ends. The bride, regardless of whether she was seen as victim or participant, was pulled into the same net of condemnation, her name whispered with equal parts pity and scorn. For the church, this was more than a scandal. It was a test of faith, a reminder to the community that sin could take root even in their midst, and vigilance against temptation was necessary to preserve purity. The son, devastated and stripped of dignity, may have considered legal recourse. But in 1888 Arkansas, justice was not always found in the courtroom. Filing charges would mean airing the family's humiliation before strangers, and such cases were rarely pursued unless tied to clear violations of law like property disputes or inheritance. A broken engagement or stolen bride, however devastating, was often treated as a private matter, albeit one with devastating social consequences. If the son sought counsel, he would likely have been told that while the law could offer limited remedies, true justice lay beyond its reach. Some whispered that he should have challenged his father outright, through confrontation or even violence. For in a culture still steeped in honor, vengeance was sometimes seen as the only balm for betrayal. But others counseled silence, urging him to rebuild his life away from the shadow of his father's disgrace. This clash between law, religion, and community ethics was profound. The law could not adequately punish what had occurred, for it was not structured to handle sins of the heart, cloaked in twisted legality. The church could thunder its disapproval, but it had no means of forcibly undoing the marriage. The community, meanwhile, enforced its own brand of justice, ostracism. The father might remain legally wed, but he was condemned socially, shut out of gatherings, scorned in markets, and marked as an outcast. His presence became an affront to the values the town held dear, and his name was invoked as a warning to others of what happened when lust and betrayal triumphed over duty. The bride's position was precarious. If she had been coerced, the law offered little recourse to free her from the binding vows once taken, for annulments were rare and required proof difficult to obtain. If she had been willing, she bore the weight of community scorn, her reputation irreparably stained. In either case, she was trapped between legal recognition of her marriage and spiritual condemnation of her union. The church might deny her communion, the neighbors might shun her presence, yet the law demanded she remain tied to the man who had claimed her. Her life became a battleground of contradictions, where each step she took reminded her of the clash between worldly legality and eternal judgment. For the son, the sense of injustice ran deeper than the loss of his bride. He had been wronged in every realm that mattered, robbed of love in the personal sphere, stripped of honor in the social, and denied true justice in both the legal and religious domains. He became a living testament to the failure of the systems meant to protect him, a man whose suffering underscored the gaps between law, faith, and morality. Some said his only option was to leave, to carve out a new life in a town where his shame was not known. Others believed he should have fought back, demanding that either the courts or the church formally denounce the marriage. But in the end, silence often prevailed, leaving his grief to fester quietly in the corners of his heart. The scandal thus became more than just a family tragedy. It exposed the limitations of institutions themselves. The law, precise but cold, could not capture the depth of betrayal. The church, righteous but powerless, could only condemn without undoing. And the community, bound by both, wielded judgment not with legal codes or scripture but with gossip, exclusion, and the quiet cruelty of collective memory. Together, these forces created a storm that no one could escape. The father might live out his days beside the bride, but neither law nor church nor society would ever absolve him. His act had carved a wound into the fabric of his family and his town, a wound that no authority could heal. The aftermath of the scandal in 1888 Arkansas lingered like a bruise that never healed. etched into the lives of all who had been swept into its storm. The sun, once filled with the bright promise of love and future, now carried the weight of heartbreak so heavy it seemed to bend his very posture. At first, his grief consumed him in silence, for words could not capture the depth of betrayal he felt. The woman he adored, the bride he had envisioned walking down the aisle, had been taken from him not by fate, not by death, but by his own father's hands. Each morning he awoke, it was as though a cruel dream replayed itself, one he could not escape. His heart hardened into anger, and whispers among neighbors suggested he had contemplated revenge, whether through violent confrontation or by shaming his father publicly. Yet in a town so tightly bound by gossip and judgment, even his rage was stifled, for any action would only deepen the scandal and drag his own dignity further into the mud. There were nights, though, when his fury flared unchecked, when bottles of whiskey became companions, and he cursed his father's name into the empty fields. Friends who had once shared laughter with him at the prospect of his marriage now avoided his gaze, unsure of what comfort could ever suffice. Some claimed he left town for stretches, wandering to neighboring counties in search of work or anonymity, only to return again to the haunting memories of what he had lost. Others believed he never truly recovered, that the wound carved by betrayal never closed, leaving him a hollowed man who carried bitterness like a scar across his soul. For the bride, the aftermath was equally harrowing but more complex. To some, she was a victim, forced into a union with a man whose authority and power loomed too large to resist. If she had been coerced, her eyes may have told the story, haunted, distant, resigned to a fate she could not alter. Yet there were others in the community who refused to grant her innocence, whispering that she must have harbored secret feelings for the father, that she had betrayed her fiancé willingly. This duality of perception left her trapped, caught between pity and contempt, never truly embraced by anyone. Women who once admired her beauty now shunned her in church pews, shifting their skirts away as though she carried a contagion. Men who once praised her grace now muttered crude jokes in back rooms, mocking her fall from honor. Whether she loved the father or loathed him, she was condemned all the same. Her role in the household became a silent prison, bound to a man who had upended her life and the lives around them. She may have tried to find small ways to survive, keeping to domestic duties, avoiding the gaze of neighbors, raising her head only when necessary. If children came from the union, their existence complicated matters further, for they carried both the blood of scandal and the weight of suspicion. Each step she took into the marketplace or along the dusty road was a reminder that she was no longer simply a woman, but the living embodiment of betrayal. Survival became her only recourse, and survival in such a climate meant enduring stares, whispers, and the unending weight of judgment. The father, at the center of the storm, lived in a kind of exile, even as he remained within the community. His decision had cost him everything that once gave his name respect, honor, trust, leadership, kinship. Neighbors no longer greeted him warmly at the general store. Fellow farmers turned their backs when he approached. The church pew where his family once sat in prominence remained empty, for he was not welcome among the faithful. He had chosen desire over duty, and though the law might have recognized his union, society branded him as little more than a pariah. Some men whispered that he carried himself with defiance, head held high as if daring anyone to challenge him, while others claimed his eyes betrayed the truth, a deep loneliness, a recognition that in pursuing his obsession, he had severed every bond that once mattered. Life within his household was a ghost of what it had been. The absence of his son carved a silence into every corner, a reminder of the betrayal that could never be undone. If he attempted to justify his actions, few listened. If he believed love had guided him, love was a poor substitute for the isolation he now endured. His days may have been filled with labor on the land, his nights with a gnawing emptiness that no companionship could erase. The price of his choice was exile in plain sight, a man living among his community yet apart from it, forever marked by disgrace. The rupture within the family was permanent. Bonds that once defined their identity shattered irreparably. The son could not forgive. The mother, if alive, could not reconcile. and extended kin found themselves torn between loyalty and shame. Gatherings became impossible, for no one could share a meal without the shadow of betrayal looming over the table. Family ties, once the strongest force in rural Arkansas, dissolved like dust in the wind. The scandal did not end with the marriage. It lived on in every strained glance, every unspoken word, every refusal to acknowledge what had been done. As years passed, the aftermath of the scandal became less about the singular act and more about its consequences. The son lived on, but with the hollowed look of one who had lost more than love. He had lost faith in family itself. The bride existed in limbo, neither embraced nor fully condemned, surviving on the edge of social acceptance without ever reclaiming the respect she once held. The father bore the greatest weight of all, his legacy forever stained, his name carried in whispers rather than pride. And the family, as a whole, became a cautionary tale, invoked whenever conversations turned to honor, duty, and the dangers of unchecked desire. The long-term rupture stretched far beyond the individuals involved. Cousins, aunts, and uncles bore the shame in their own circles. The family name, once perhaps respected, became synonymous with betrayal. Generations that followed could not entirely escape the shadow, for the story was told and retold, etched into the oral history of the town. Even as time dulled the edges of the outrage, the memory never vanished. The aftermath was not merely the immediate sorrow of broken hearts, but the enduring scar of a family torn apart. A scar that Arkansas would remember long after the dust of 1888 had settled.